I will answer any questions you wish to ask." "So," the little detective exclaimed, "you pit your wits against Hercule Poirot, do you? Very well then. Be assured, however, madame, that we shall get at the truth just the same. It's at the table, but by a less pleasant process." "I have nothing to conceal," Lucia told him defiantly. Taking from his pocket the letter Edward Raynor had given him, Poirot handed it to Lucia. "A few days ago, Sir Claude received this anonymous letter," he revealed. Lucia glanced through the letter, apparently unmoved. "Well, what of it?" she commented as she handed it back to Poirot. "Have you heard the name Selma Gretz before?" "Never." "Who is she?" asked Lucia. "She died in Genoa last November," Poirot informed her. "Indeed?" "Perhaps you met her there," Poirot remarked, replacing the letter in his pocket. "In fact, I think you did." "I was never in Genoa in my life," Lucia insisted sharply. "Then if anyone were to say that they had seen you there, they would be mistaken." Poirot persisted. "But I understand, madame, that you first met your husband in Genoa." "Did Richard say that? How stupid of him. We met first in Milan." "Then the woman you were with in Genoa," Lucia interrupted him angrily. "I tell you, I was never in Genoa." "Ah, pardon," exclaimed Poirot. "Of God, you said so just now." "Yet it is odd." "What is odd?" Poirot closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. His voice came purringly from between his lips. "I will tell you a little story, madame," he announced, taking out a pocketbook. "I have a friend who does the photography for certain London journals. He takes, how do you say this, snapshots of countesses and other fashionable ladies who bathe themselves on the Lido, that sort of thing." Poirot searched in the pocketbook before continuing. "Last November, this friend of mine, he finds himself in Genoa, and he recognizes a very notorious lady. The Baronne de Giaour, she calls herself at this time, and she is the chère amie of a very naughty French diplomat. The world talks, but that does not matter to the lady because the diplomat, he talks also. And that is what she wants. He is more amorous than discreet, you understand." Poirot broke off with an innocent air. "I do not bore you, I hope, madame." "Not at all, but I hardly see the point of the story." Looking through the contents of his pocketbook, Poirot continued, "I am arriving at the point I have shown you, madame. My friend, he shows me a snapshot he has taken. We agree with each other that the Baronne de Giaour is une très belle femme, and we are not at all surprised at the behavior of the diplomat." "Is that all?" "No, madame. You see, the lady was not alone. She was photographed walking with her daughter, and that daughter, madame, had a very beautiful face, and one, moreover, that it would not be at all easy to forget." Poirot rose, made his most gallant bow, and closed his pocketbook. "Of course, I recognized that face as soon as I arrived here." Lucia looked at Poirot and drew her breath in sharply. "Ah!" she exclaimed. After a moment she pulled herself together and laughed. "Don't, by terre, Monsieur Poirot, what a curious mistake. Of course I see the point about your questions now. I remember the Baronne de Giaour perfectly, and her daughter as well. The daughter was rather a dull girl, but the mother fascinated me. I was quite romantic about her, and went out walking with her on several occasions. I think my diversion amused her. All that was how the mistake arose. This is how someone thought that I must be the woman's daughter. Lucia sank back in her chair. Poirot nodded slow appreciation, at which Lucia appeared visibly to relax. Then suddenly, leaning over the table towards her, the detective remarked, "But I thought you had never been to Genoa." Taken unawares, Lucia gasped. She stared at Poirot as he put his pocketbook back in an inner pocket of his jacket. "You have no photograph," she said. It was half question, half statement. "No," Poirot confessed. "I have no photograph, madame. I knew the name that Selma gets bastanto in Genoa. The rest? My father's his photography. All of that was a harmless little invention of mine." Lucia leapt to her feet, her eyes blazing with anger. "You set a trap for me," she exclaimed furiously. Poirot shrugged his shoulders. "Yes, madame," he affirmed. "I fear I had no alternative." "What has all this to do with Sir Claud's death?" Lucia muttered, as though to herself, looking wildly about the room. Poirot affected a tone of indifference as, instead of answering, he posed another question. Matter a speck of dust from his jacket as he spoke. "Is it true that you lost a valuable diamond necklace a little while ago?" Lucia glared at him. "Again I ask," her words emerging as though through clenched teeth, "what has that to do with Sir Claud's death?" Poirot spoke slowly and deliberately. "First, a stolen necklace. Then a stolen formula. Both would bring in a very large sum of money." "What do you mean?" Lucia gasped. "I mean, madame, that I would like you to answer this question. How much did Dr. Corelli want this time?" Lucia turned away from Poirot. I will not answer any more questions," she whispered. "Because you are afraid?" asked Poirot, moving to her. Lucia turned to face him again, flinging her head back in a gesture of defiance. "No," she asserted, "I'm not afraid. I simply don't know what you are talking about. Why should Dr. Corelli ask me for money?" "To buy his silence," Poirot replied. "The Amorys are a proud family, and you would not have wanted them to know that you are the daughter of Selma Gertz." Lucia glared at Poirot for a moment without replying, and then, her shoulders sagging, she collapsed onto a stool, resting her head in her hands. At least a minute elapsed before she looked up at the sky. "Does Richard know?" she murmured. "He does not know yet, madame," Poirot replied slowly. Lucia sounded desperate as she pleaded. "Don't tell him, monsieur. Poirot, please, don't tell him. He's so proud of his family name, so proud of his honor. I was wicked to have married him, but I was so miserable. I hated that life, that awful life. I was forced to live with my mother. I felt degraded by it, but what could I do? And then, when Mamma died, I was at last free. Free to be honest. Free to get away from that life of lies and intrigue. I met Richard. That was the most wonderful thing that had ever happened to me. Richard came into my life. I loved him, and he wanted to marry me. How could I tell him who I was? Why should I tell him?" And then, Poirot prompted her gently. "Corelli recognized you somewhere with Monsieur Amory, and began to blackmail you." "Yes, but I had no money of my own," Lucia gasped. "I sold the necklace and paid him. I thought that was the end of it all, but yesterday he turned up here. He had heard of this formula Sir Claud had invented. He wanted you to steal it for him. Yes. And did you? Asked Poirot, moving closer to her. You won't believe me? No. Madame Boucher shaking her head sorrowfully. Poirot contemplated the beautiful young woman with a look of sympathy. Yes, my child, he assured her. I will still believe you. Have courage, and trust Papa Poirot, yet just tell me the truth. Did you take Sir Claude's secret formula? No, I didn't, Lucia declared vehemently, but it's true that I meant to. Corelli made a key to Sir Claude's safe from an impression I took. Taking a key from his pocket and showing it to her, Poirot asked, Is this it? Lucia looked at the key. Yes. It was all quite easy. Corelli gave me that key. I was in the study, just steeling myself to open the safe, when Sir Claude came in and found me. That's the truth, I swear it. I believe you, madame, said Poirot. He returned the key to his pocket, moved to the armchair and sat, placing the tips of his fingers together and pondering for a moment. And yet you acquiesced eagerly in Sir Claude's scheme of plunging the room into darkness. I didn't want to be searched, Lucia explained. Corelli had passed me a note at the same time as the key, and they were both at my dress. What did you do with them? Poirot asked her. When the lights went out, I threw the key as far from me as I could, over there. She pointed in the direction of the chair in which Edward Rayner had sat on the previous evening. And the note that Corelli passed to you? Poirot continued. I didn't know what to do with the note. Lucia rose and went to the table, so I slipped it between the leaves of a book. Taking a book from the table, she searched in it. Yes, it is still here, she declared, as she removed a piece of paper from the book. Do you wish to see it? No, madame. It is yours? Poirot assured her. Sitting in the chair by the table, Lucia tore the note into small pieces, which she put in her handbag. Poirot watched her, but paused before asking. One little thing more, madame. Did you by any chance tear your dress last night? No? Lucia sounded surprised. During those moments of darkness, asked Poirot, did you hear the sound of a dress tearing? Lucia considered for a few seconds, then, Yes, now that you mention it, she said, I believe I did, but it was not mine. It must have been Miss Amory's or Barbara's. Well, we will not worry about that, remarked Poirot dismissively. Now, let us pass on to something else. Who poured out Sir Claude's coffee last night? I did. And you put it down on that table beside your own cup? Yes. Poirot rose, leaned forward over the table towards Lucia, and suddenly shot his next question at her. Into which cup did you put the hyoscine? Lucia looked at him wildly. How did you know? She gasped. It is my business to know things. Into which cup, madame? Lucia sighed. My own. Why? Because I wanted to die. Richard suspected that there was something between Corelli and me, that we were having an affair. It would not have been further from the truth. I hated Corelli. I hate him now. But as I had failed to obtain the formula for him, I was sure he would expose me to Richard. To kill myself was a way out. The only way. A swift, dreamless sleep, and no awakening. That's what he said. Who said that to you? Dr. Corelli. I begin to see. I begin to see, said Poirot slowly. He pointed to the cup on the table. This is your cup then? A full cup, untwisted? Yes. What made you change your mind about drinking it? Richard came over to me. He said that he would take me away, abroad, that he would get the money to do so somehow. He gave me back hope. Now listen to me carefully, madame, said Poirot gravely. This morning Dr. Graham took away the cup that was beside Sir Claude's chair. Yes? His fellow doctors would have found nothing but the dregs of coffee in it. He paused. Without looking at him, Lucia answered, Of course. That is correct, yes? Poirot persisted. Lucia looked straight ahead of her without replying. Then looking up at Poirot, she exclaimed, Why are you staring at me like that? You frightened me. I said, Poirot repeated, that they took away the cup that was beside Sir Claude's chair this morning. Let us suppose, instead, that they had taken away the cup that was by his chair last night. He moved to the table near the door and took a coffee cup from the plant bowl. Let us suppose that they had taken this cup. Lucia rose quickly, put her hands up to her face. You know, she gasped. Poirot moved to her. Madame. His voice now was stern. They will test their cup, if they have not already done so, and they will find nothing. But last night I took some of the dregs from the original cup. What would you say if I were to tell you that there was hyacinth in Sir Claude's cup? But she looked stricken. She swayed, but then recovered herself. For a moment she said nothing. Then, You are right, she whispered. You are quite right. Her voice rang out suddenly. I killed him. I put the hyacinth in his cup. Going to the table, she grasped the full cup of coffee. This one is only coffee. She raised the full cup to her lips, but Poirot sprang forward, interposing his hand between the cup and her lips. They looked at each other intently for a time, and Lucia burst into sobs. Poirot took the cup from her and placed it on the table. Madame, he explained. Why did you stump me? Lucia murmured. Madame, Poirot told her, the world is very beautiful. Why should you wish to leave it? Oh. Lucia collapsed onto the settee, sobbing bitterly. And Poirot spoke. His voice was warm and gentle. You told me the truth. You put the hyacinth in your own cup. I believe you. But there was hyacinth in the other cup as well. Now speak the truth to me again. Who put the hyacinth in Sir Claude's cup? Lucia stared at Poirot in terror. No, you're wrong. He didn't. I killed him, she cried hysterically. Who didn't? Whom is your shilling, madame? Tell me, Poirot demanded. He didn't, I tell you, Lucia sobbed. There was a knock at the door. That will be the police, declared Poirot. We have very little time. I will make it 2 promises, madame. Promise number 1 is that I will save you. But I killed him, I tell you. Lucia's voice was almost at screaming pitch. Promise number 2, Poirot continued imperturbably, is that I will save your husband. Ha! Lucia gasped, gazing at him in bewilderment. The butler, Treadwell, entered the room. Addressing Poirot, he announced, "Inspector Japp from Scotland Yard." 15 minutes later, Inspector Japp, accompanied by Johnson, a young constable, had finished his initial inspection of the library. Japp, a bluff, hearty, middle-aged man with a thick-set figure and a ratty complexion, was reminiscing with Poirot and Hastings, who had returned from his exile in the garden. "Yes," Japp told his constable, "Mr. Poirot and I go back a long way. You heard me speak often of him. He was still a member of the Belgian police force when we first worked together. It was the Abercrombie forgery case, wasn't it, Poirot? Yes, we ran him down in Brussels. Well, those were great days. And, do you remember Baron Altara? Oh, that was a pretty row for you. He eluded the clutches of half the police in Europe, but we nailed him in Antwerp thanks to Mr. Poirot here." Japp turned from Johnson to Poirot. "And then we met again in this country, didn't we, Poirot?" exclaimed. "You'd retired by then, of course. You solved that mysterious affair at Styles, remember? Last time we collaborated on a case was about 2 years ago, wasn't it? That affair of the Italian nobleman in London. Well, it's really good to see you again, Poirot. You could have knocked me down with a feather when I came in a few minutes ago and saw your funny old mug." "My mug?" asked Poirot, looking puzzled. English slang never failed to mystify him. "Your face, I mean, old chap," Japp explained with a grin. "Well, shall we work together on this?" Poirot smiled. "My good chap, you know my little weaknesses." "Secretive old beggar, aren't you?" remarked Japp, smacking Poirot on the shoulder. "I say, that Mrs. Amory you were talking to when I came in, she's a good looker. Richard Amory's wife, I suppose. I bet you would enjoy yourself, you old dog." The inspector gave a rather coarse laugh and seated himself on a chair by the table. "Anyway," he continued, "this is just the sort of case that suits you down to the ground. It pleases your tortuous mind. Now, I loathe a poisoning case. Nothing to go on, and to find out what they ate and drank and who handled it and who so much as breathed on it. Now, I admit Dr. Graham seems pretty clear on the case. He says the dope must have been in the coffee. According to him, such a large dose would have had an almost instantaneous effect. Of course, we shall know for certain when we get the analyst's report, but we've got enough to go on." Japp rose to his feet. "Well, I've finished with this room," he declared. "I'd better have a few words with Mr. Richard Amory, I suppose. And then I'll see this Dr. Corelli. Looks as though he's our man. But keep an open mind, that's what I always say, keep an open mind." He moved to the door. "Come in, Poirot." "But certainly I will accompany you," said Poirot, joining him. "Captain Hastings, too, I've no doubt." Japp laughed. "Sticks as close to you as your shadow, doesn't he, Poirot?" Poirot threw a meaningful glance at his friend. "Perhaps Hastings would prefer to remain here," he remarked. Taking his cue in a somewhat obvious manner, Hastings replied, yes, I think I'll stay here." "Well, as you please." Japp sounded surprised. He and Poirot left, followed by the young constable, and a moment later Barbara Amory entered from the garden, through the French windows, wearing a pink blouse and light-colored slacks. "Ah, there you are, my pet. I say, what's this that's just blown in upon us?" she asked Hastings as she moved across to the settee and sat down. "Is it the police?" "Yes," Hastings told her. He joined her on the settee. "It's, Inspector Japp of Scotland Yard. You've got to see your cousin now to ask him a few questions." "We won't ask me questions, do you think?" "Well, I don't imagine so. But even if he does," Hastings assured her, "there's nothing to be alarmed about." "Oh, I'm not alarmed," Barbara declared. "In fact, I think it would be absolutely wizard. It would be so tempting to embroider a bit, just to make a sensation. I adore sensation, don't you?" Hastings looked puzzled. I really don't know." "No, I don't think I adore sensation." Barbara Amory regarded him quizzically. You know, you intrigue me, she declared. Where have you been all your life? Well, I've spent several years in South America. I knew it, Barbara exclaimed. She gestured with a hand over her eyes, the wide open spaces. That's why you're so deliciously old-fashioned. Hastings now looked offended. Why, I'm sorry, he said stiffly. Oh, but I adore it. Barbara hastened to explain. I think you're a pet. Absolute pet. Oh, what exactly do you mean by old-fashioned? Well, Barbara continued, I'm sure you believe in all sorts of stuffy old things like decency and not telling lies except for very good reason and putting a good face on things. Well, quite, agreed Hastings in some surprise. Don't you? Me? Well, for example, do you expect me to keep up the fiction that Uncle Claude's death is a regrettable incident? Or isn't it? Hastings sounded shocked. My dear, exclaimed Barbara. She rose and perched herself on the edge of the coffee table. As far as I'm concerned, it's the most marvelous thing that ever happened. You don't know what a low skin-flint he was. You don't know how he ground us all down. She stopped, overcome by the strength of her feelings. Embarrassed, Hastings began, I wish you wouldn't, but was interrupted by Barbara. You don't like honesty? She asked. That's just what I thought you'd be like. You'd prefer me to be wearing black instead of this, be talking in a hushed voice about poor Uncle Claude, so good to us all. Oh, Bernie, Hastings exclaimed. Oh, you needn't pretend, Barbara went on. I knew that's what you'd turn out to be like, and I got to know you properly. But what I say is that life isn't long enough for all that lying and pretense. Uncle Claude wasn't good to us at all. I'm certain we're all glad he's dead, really, in our heart of hearts. Yes, even Aunt Caroline. Poor dear, she stood him longer than any of us. Barbara suddenly calmed down. When she spoke again, it was in a milder tone. You know, I've been thinking. Scientifically speaking, Aunt Caroline might have poisoned Uncle Claude. That heart attack last night was really very queer. I never believed it was a heart attack at all. I'm just surprised that suppressing her feelings all these years led to Aunt Caroline developing some powerful complex. Well, I suppose it's theoretically possible, Hastings murmured guardedly. I wonder who pinched the formula, though, Barbara continued. Everyone says it was the Italian, but personally I suspect Treadwell. Well, Butler, good heavens, why? Hastings looked perplexed. Well, I'm very orthodox in some ways, Barbara remarked. I've been brought up to suspect the least likely person. That's who it is in all the best murder mysteries, and Treadwell is certainly the least likely person. Well, except you, perhaps, Hastings suggested with a laugh. Oh, me! Barbara smiled uncertainly as she rose and moved away from him. How curious, she murmured to herself. Most curious, Hastings asked, rising to his feet. Something I've just thought of. Let's go out in the garden. I hate it in here. She moved towards the French windows. Oh, I am afraid I have to stay here, Hastings told her. Why? I mustn't leave this room. You know, Barbara observed, you've got a complex about this room. Do you remember outside? There we all were completely shattered by the disappearance of the formula, and in you strode and produced the most marvelous anticlimax by saying in your best conversational manner, "Oh, the delightful room, Mr. Amory." It was so funny when the two of you walked in. There was this extraordinary little man with you, no more than 5'4", but with an air of immense dignity, and you being, ooh, so polite. Nora Poirot is rather odd at first sight, I admit, Hastings agreed, and he has all kinds of little foibles. For instance, he has an absolute passion for neatness of any kind. If he sees an ornament sit crooked or a speck of dust, or even a slight disarray in someone's attire, it's absolute torture to him. Now you make such a wonderful contrast to each other, Barbara said, laughing. Poirot's methods of detection are very much his own, you know, Hastings continued. Order and method are his gods. He has great disdain for tangible evidence, things like footprints and cigarette ash, you know what I mean. In fact, he maintains that taken by themselves, they would never enable a detective to solve a problem. But true work, he says, is done from within. And then he taps that egg-shaped head of his and remarks with great satisfaction, the little gray cells of the brain always remember the little gray cells, mon ami. Oh, I think it's a puppet, Barbara declared. Not as sweet as you with your what a delightful room. It is a delightful room, Hastings insisted, sounding rather nettled. Personally, I don't agree with you, said Barbara. She took his hand and tried to pull him towards the open French windows. Anyway, you've had quite enough of it for now. Come on. No, you don't understand, Hastings declared, taking his hand away from her. I promise Poirot. Barbara spoke slowly. You promised Monsieur Poirot that you would not leave this room. But why? Well, I can't tell you that. Oh. Barbara was silent for a moment or two. Then her manner changed. She moved behind Hastings and began to recite in an exaggerated dramatic voice. The boys stood on the burning deck. I beg your pardon, whence all but he had fled. Well, my pet? I simply cannot understand you, Hastings declared in exasperation. Oh, why should you understand me? Oh, you really are a delight, declared Barbara, slipping her arm through his. Come and be vamped. Oh, really, you think you're adorable. You're pulling my leg. Not at all, Barbara insisted. I'm crazy about you. You're positively pre-war. She pulled him to the French windows, and this time Hastings allowed himself to yield to the pressure of her arm. You really are an extraordinary person, he told her. But quite different from any girl I've ever met. I'm delighted to hear it. That's a very good sign, said Barbara, as they now stood face to face, framed in the open windows. A good sign, yes, makes a girl feel hopeful. Hastings blushed, and Barbara laughed light-heartedly as she dragged him out into the garden. After Barbara's exit with Hastings into the garden, the library remained unoccupied for no longer than a moment or two. Then the door to the hall opened, and Miss Amory entered, carrying the small work-bag. She went over to the settee, put the bag down, knelt, and began to feel at the back of the seat. As she did so, Dr. Corelli entered by the other door, carrying a hat and a small suitcase. Seeing Miss Amory, Corelli stopped and murmured a word of apology at having intruded upon her. Miss Amory rose from the settee, looking a trifle flustered. I was searching for a knitting needle, she explained, unnecessarily brandishing her discovery as she spoke. It had slipped out behind the seat. Then, taking in the significance of his suitcase, she asked, Are you leaving us, Dr. Corelli? Corelli put his hat and suitcase on a chair. I feel I can no longer trespass on your hospitality, he announced. Obviously delighted, Miss Amory was polite enough to murmur, Oh, well, of course, if you feel like that. I then remembered the situation in which the occupants of the house currently found themselves, she added. But I thought there was some tiresome formalities and... Her voice trailed off indecisively. Oh, that is all arranged, Corelli assured her. No, well, if you feel you must go, I do indeed. Then I will order the car, Miss Amory declared, briskly moving to the bell above the fireplace. Oh, no, Corelli insisted. That, too, is all arranged. But you've even had to carry your suitcase down yourself. Really, the servants, they're all demoralized, completely demoralized. She returned at the settee and took her knitting from her bag. They can't concentrate, Dr. Corelli. They cannot keep their heads. So curious, is it not? Looking distinctly on edge, Corelli replied offhandedly, Very curious. He glanced at the telephone. Miss Amory began to knit, keeping up a flow of aimless conversation as she did so. I suppose you are catching the 12:15. You mustn't run it too fine. Oh, not that I want to pass, of course. I always say that passing up, but yes, indeed. Dr. Corelli interrupted her peremptorily. There is plenty of time, I think. I wondered if I might use the telephone. Miss Amory looked up momentarily. Oh, yes, of course, she said, as she continued to knit. It seemed not to have occurred to her that Dr. Corelli might have wanted to make his telephone call in private. Thank you, moaned Corelli, moving to the desk, making a pretense of looking up a number in the telephone directory. He glanced across impatiently at Miss Amory. I think your niece was looking for you, he remarked. Miss Amory's only reaction to this information was to talk about her niece while continuing with her knitting undisturbed. But dear Barbara, she exclaimed, such a sweet creature, who knew she leads rather a sad life here, far too dull for a young girl. Oh, well, things will be different now, I dare say. She dwelt pleasurably on this thought for a moment before continuing. Not that I hadn't done all I could, but what a girl needs is a little gaiety. All the beeswax in the world would make up for that. Dr. Corelli's face was a study in incomprehension, mixed with more than a little irritation. Beeswax? He felt obliged to ask. Yes, beeswax. Or is it Bemax? They're vitamins, you know, or at least that's what it says on the tin. A and B and C and D, all of them, except the one that keeps you from having Betty. And I barely think there's no need for that if one is living in England. It's not a disease one encounters here. Comes, I believe, from polishing the rice in native countries. So interesting. I made Mr. Raynor take it. A beeswax, I mean, after breakfast every day. He was looking pale, poor young fellow. I tried to make Lucia take it too, but you wouldn't. Miss Amory shook her head disapprovingly. And to think when I was a girl I was strictly forbidden to eat caramels because of the beeswax. No, I mean beeswax, Bemax. That time has changed, you know. Times do change. Though he attempted to disguise the fact, by now Dr. Corelli was positively fuming. Yes, Miss Amory, he replied as politely as he could manage. Moving towards her, he tried a somewhat more direct approach. I think your niece is calling you. Calling me? Yes, do you not hear? Miss Amory listened. No, she confessed. How curious. She rolled up her knitting. You must have keen ears, Dr. Corelli. Not that my hearing is bad. Indeed, I've been told. She dropped her bowl of wool and Corelli picked it up for her. Well, thank you so much, she said. All the Amorys have keen hearing, you know. She rose from the settee. My father kept his faculties in the most remarkable way. He could read without glasses when he was 80. She dropped the bowl of wool again, and again Corelli stooped to retrieve it for her. Oh, thank you so much. Miss Amory continued. A remarkable man, Dr. Corelli. My father, I mean, such a remarkable man. He always slept in a 4-post feather bed, and the windows of his bedroom were never opened. The night air, he used to say, was most injurious. Unfortunately, when he had an attack of gout, he was nursed by a young woman who insisted on the window being opened at the top, and my poor father died of it. She dropped the bowl of wool yet again. This time, after picking it up, Corelli planted it firmly in her hand and led her to the door. Miss Amory moved slowly, talking all the time. I do not care at all for hospital nurses, Dr. Corelli, she informed him. They gossip about their cases, they drink far too much tea, and they always upset the sentence. Very true, dear lady, very true. Corelli agreed hastily, opening the door for her. Thank you so much, Miss Amory said as he propelled her out of the room. Shutting the door after her, Corelli moved quickly to the desk and lifted the telephone receiver. After a pause, he spoke into it softly but urgently. This is a Margaret Cleave 314. I want a lump of 3. No, 5-3. That's all right. Will you call me? Right. He replaced the receiver and then stood, biting his nails impatiently. After a moment, he crossed to the door of the study, opened it, and entered the room. Hardly they'd done so when Edward Raynor came into the library from the hall. Glancing around, Raynor strolled casually to the fireplace. He touched the bars of spills on the mantelpiece, and as he did so, Corelli came back into the room from the study. As Corelli closed the study door, Raynor turned and saw him. "I didn't know you were in here," said the secretary. "I'm waiting for the phone call," Corelli explained. "Oh." After a pause, Corelli spoke again. "When did the police inspector come?" "About 20 minutes ago, I believe." "Have you seen him?" "Only in the distance," replied Corelli. "He's a Scotland Yard man," Raynor informed him. "Apparently he happened to be down in the neighborhood tearing up somehow the case, so he was called in by the local priest." "Oh, that was a piece of luck, eh?" observed Corelli. "Wasn't it?" The telephone rang and Raynor moved towards it, walking quickly ahead of him to the phone. Corelli said, "I think that would be my call." He looked at Raynor. "I wonder if you would mind doing—" "Oh, certainly, my dear fellow," the secretary assured him. "Out there, out." Raynor left the room and Corelli lifted the receiver. He spoke quietly. "Hello?" he said. "Miguel." "Yes?" "No, damn it, I haven't. It's a mean impossible." "No, you don't understand. The older gentleman died last night. I'm leaving at once. Jap's here." "Jap? You know this Scotland Yard man?" "No, I've not met him yet." "I hope so too." "At the usual place." 9:30 tonight. Bright. Replacing the receiver, Corelli moved to the recess, picked up his suitcase, put on his hat, and went towards the French windows. At that moment, Hercule Poirot entered from the garden and he and Corelli collided. "I beg your pardon," said the Italian. "Not at all," replied Poirot politely, continuing to block the way out. "If you would allow me to pass." "Impossible," said Poirot mildly. "Quite impossible. I insist." "I shouldn't," murmured Poirot with a friendly smile. Suddenly Corelli charged at Poirot. The little detective stepped briskly aside, tripping Corelli up neatly with an unexpected movement, and taking the Italian doctor's suitcase from him at the same time. At that moment, Jap slid into the room behind Poirot, and Corelli fell into the inspector's arms. "Allah, what's all this?" exclaimed Inspector Jap. "Why, bless me if it isn't Tonio." "Ah!" Poirot gave a little laugh as he moved away from them both. "I thought, my dear Jap, that you would probably be able to give a name to this gentleman." "Oh, I know all about him," Jap affirmed. "Tonio's quite a public character, aren't you, Tonio?" "I'll bet you were surprised at Monsieur Poirot's move just then." "What'd you call that stuff, Poirot? Jiu-jitsu or such like, isn't it?" Poor old Tonio." As Poirot placed the Italian's suitcase on the table and opened it, Corelli growled at Jap. "You've got nothing against me. You can't hold me." "I wonder," said the inspector. "I'll bet we won't have far to look for the man who stole that formula and did in the old gentleman." Turning to Poirot, he added, "That formula is absolutely bang in Tonio's line, and since we found him trying to make a getaway, I shouldn't be surprised if he's got the goods on him this minute." "I agree with you," declared Poirot. Jap ran his hands over Corelli while Poirot went through the suitcase. "Well?" Jap asked Poirot. "Nothing," the detective replied, closing the suitcase. "Nothing." "I am disappointed." "You think you're so very clever, do you not?" snobbed Corelli. "But I could tell you," Poirot interrupted him, speaking quietly and significantly. "You could, perhaps. But it would be very unwise." Startled, Corelli exclaimed, "What do you mean?" "Monsieur Poirot is quite right," Jap declared. "You'd better keep your mouth shut." Moving to the hall door, he opened it and called, "Johnson?" The young constable put his head around the door. "Get the whole family together for me, will you?" Jap asked him. I want them all here." "Yes, sir," said Johnson as he left the room. "I protest, Corelli gasped. Suddenly he grabbed his suitcase and made a dash towards the French windows. Jap rushed after him, grabbed him, and threw him onto the settee, taking the suitcase from him as he did so. "No one's hurt you yet, so don't squeal," Jap barked at the now thoroughly cowed Italian. Poirot strolled towards the French windows. "Please don't go away now, Monsieur Poirot," Jap called after him, putting Corelli's suitcase down by the coffee table. "This should be interesting." No, my dear chap, I am not leaving," Poirot assured him. "I shall be right here. This family gathering, as you say, will be most interesting indeed." A few minutes later, when the Amory family began to assemble in the library, Corelli was still seated on the settee, looking rather sullen, while Poirot continued to hover by the French windows. Barbara Amory, with Hastings in tow, returned from the garden through the French windows, and Barbara moved to share the settee with Corelli, while Hastings went to stand by Poirot's side. Poirot whispered to his colleague, "It would be helpful, Hastings, if you would make a note, and mental note, you understand, of where they all choose to sit." "Helpful? How?" asked Hastings. "Psychologically, my friend," was Poirot's only reply. When Lucia entered the room, Hastings watched her as she sat in the chair to the right of the table. Richard arrived with his aunt, Miss Amory, who sat on the stool as Richard moved behind the table to keep a protective eye on his wife. Edward Raynal was the last to arrive, taking up a position behind the armchair. He was followed into the room by the Constable Johnson, who shut the door and stood close to it. Richard Amory introduced Inspector Japp to those two members of the family whom Japp had not already met. "My aunt, Miss Amory," he announced, "and my cousin, Miss Barbara Amory." Acknowledging the introduction, Barbara asked, "What's all the excitement, Inspector?" Japp avoided her question. "Now, I think we're all here, are we not?" he remarked, moving to the fireplace. Miss Amory looked bewildered and a little apprehensive. "I don't quite understand," she said to Richard. "What is this gentleman doing here?" "I think perhaps I ought to tell you something," Richard answered her. "You see, Aunt Caroline, or all of you," he added, glancing around the room, "Dr. Graham has discovered that my father was poisoned." "What?" exclaimed Raina sharply. Miss Amory gave a cry of horror. "He was poisoned with hyoscine," Richard continued. Raina gave a snout. "With hyoscine? Why, I saw—" He stopped dead, looking at Lucia. Taking a step towards him, Inspector Japp asked, "What did you say, Mr. Raina?" The secretary looked embarrassed. "Nothing, at least," he began uncertainly. His voice trailed off into silence. "Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Raina," Japp insisted, "but I've got to have the truth." "Come now. Everyone realizes you're keeping something back." "No, it's nothing, really," said the secretary. I mean, there's obviously some quite reasonable explanation." "Explanation for what, Mr. Raina?" asked Japp. Raina still hesitated. "Well," Japp prompted him. "Well, it was only that—" Raina paused again and then made up his mind to continue. It was only that I saw Mrs. Amory emptying out some of the little tablets into her hand." "When was this?" Japp asked him. "Oh, last night. I was coming out of Sir Claud's study, and the others were busy with the gramophone. Yeah, they were all clustered around it. I noticed her pick up a tube of tablets. I thought it was the hyacinth, and pour most of them out into the palm of my hand. And then the Sir Claud called me back into the study for something." "Oh, why didn't you mention this before?" asked Japp. Lucia began to speak, but the inspector silenced her. "1 minute, please, Mrs. Amory," insisted. I'd like to hear from Mr. Rayner first. Yeah, right, never thought of it again, Rayner told him. It was only when Mr. Amory said just now that Sir Claud had been poisoned with the hyacinth that it came back to me. Of course I realize it's perfectly all right. It was just the coincidence that startled me. The tablets might not have been hyacinth at all. It could have been one of the other tubes that she was handling. Japp now turned to the chair. Well, ma'am, he asked. What have you got to say about it? Lucia seemed quite composed as she answered, to make me sleep. Addressing Rayner again, Japp asked, You say she pretty well emptied the tube. It seemed so to me, said Rayner. Japp turned again to Lucia. Well, you wouldn't have needed so many tablets to make you sleep. 1 or 2 would have been sufficient. What did you do with the rest? Lucia thought for a moment before replying. I can't remember. She was about to continue when Corelli rose to his feet and burst out venomously. You'll see, Inspector. They are to see your murderess. Barbara rose quickly from the settee and moved away from Corelli, while Hastings hurried to her side. The Italian continued, You shall have the truth, Inspector. I came down here especially to see that woman. She had sent for me. She said she would get Sir Claud's formula, and she offered to sell it to me. I'll admit that I've dealt with such things in the past. That's not much of an admission, Japp advised him, moving between Corelli and Lucia. We know as much already. He turned to Lucia. All of you to say to all this, madam. Lucia rose, her face drained of color, and Richard went to her. I'm not going to allow, he began when Japp stopped him. If you please, sir. Corelli spoke again. Just to look at that woman. None of you know who she is, but I do. She's the daughter of Selma Goods, the daughter of one of the most infamous women the world has ever known. It's not true, Richard, the chair cried. It's not true. Don't listen to him, or I'll break every bone in your body, Richard Amory growled at Corelli. Japp took a pace towards Richard. Keep calm, sir, do keep calm, please, he admonished. We've got to get to the bottom of this. Japp turned to Lucia. Now then, Mrs. Amory. There was a pause, and Lucia tried to speak. She began. She looked at her husband, and then at Poirot, holding out her hand helplessly to the detective. Have courage, madame, Poirot advised her. Trusting me? Tell them the truth. We have come to the point where the lies will serve no longer. The truth will have to come out. Lucia looked pleadingly at Poirot. He merely repeated, Have courage, madame. See, be brave and speak. He returned to his position by the French windows. After a long pause, Lucia began to speak, her voice low and stifled. It is true that I am Selma Gertz's daughter. It is not true that I asked that man to come here, or that I offered to sell him Sir Claud's formula. He came here to blackmail me. Blackmail, gasped Richard, moving to her. Lucia turned to Richard. There was some urgency in her tone as she spoke. He threatened to tell you about my mother, unless I got the formula for him. And I didn't do it. I think he must have stolen it. He had the chance. He was alone in there, in the study, and I see now that he wanted me to take the hyacinth and kill myself, so that everyone would think that it was I who had stolen the formula. He almost hypnotized me. She broke down and sobbed on Richard's shoulder. With a cry of, Lucia, my darling, Richard embraced her. Then, passing his wife over to Miss Amory, who had risen, and who now embraced the distressed young woman consolingly, Richard addressed Japp. Inspector, I want to speak to you alone. Japp looked at Richard Amory for a moment and then gave a brief nod to Johnson. Are you all? He agreed. as the constable opened the door for Miss Amory and Butcher. Barbara and Hastings took the opportunity of returning to the garden through the French windows, while Edward Reynard, as he left, murmured to Richard, "I'm sorry, Mr. Amory, very sorry." As Corelli picked up his suitcase and followed Reynard out, Japp instructed his constable, "Keep your eye on Mrs. Amory, and also on Dr. Corelli." Corelli turned at the door, and Japp continued to the constable, "Must be no funny business for anyone, you understand?" "I understand, sir," replied Johnson as he followed Corelli out of the room. "I'm sorry, Mr. Amory," said Japp to Richard Amory, "but after what Mr. Rayner has told us, I'm bound to take every precaution, and I want Mr. Poirot to remain here as a witness to whatever you tell me." Richard approached Japp with the air of a man who has come to a momentous decision. Taking a deep breath, he spoke with determination. "Inspector, what is it?" asked Japp. Very deliberately and slowly, Richard replied, "I think it's time I confessed. I killed my father." Japp smiled. "Oh, I'm afraid that won't work, sir." Richard looked astonished. "What do you mean?" "No, sir," Japp continued. "Or to put it differently, that cat won't jump. You're very set on your good lady, I realize, newly married and all that. But to speak plainly to you, it's no manner of use putting your neck in a halter for the sake of a bad woman. Oh, she's a good looker and no mistake, I'll admit." "Inspector Japp," Sven Richard angrily, "there's no point in getting upset with me, sir." Japp continued imperturbably, "I've told you the plain truth without beating about the bush, and I've no doubt that Mr. Poirot here will tell you the same. I'm sorry, sir, but duty is duty, and murder is murder. That's all there is to it." Japp nodded decisively and left the room. Turning to Poirot, who had been observing the scene from the settee, Richard asked coldly, "Well, are you here to tell me the same, Monsieur Poirot?" Rising, Poirot took a cigarette case from his pocket and extracted a cigarette. Instead of answering Richard's question, he posed one of his own. "Monsieur Amory, when did you first suspect your wife?" he asked. "I never—" Richard began, but Poirot interrupted, picking up a box of matches from the table as he spoke. "Please, I beg of you, Monsieur Amory, nothing but the truth. You did suspect her, eh, Knight? You suspected her before I arrived. That is why you were so anxious to get me away from this house? I do not deny it. It is impossible to deceive Hercule Poirot." He lit his cigarette, replaced the box of matches on the table, and smiled up at the much taller man who towered over him. They made a ridiculous contrast. "You're mistaken," Richard told Poirot stiffly, "utterly mistaken. How could I suspect Lucia? And yet, of course, there is an equally good case to be made against you," Poirot continued reflectively as he resumed his seat. "You handled the drugs. You handled the coffee. You were short of money and desperate to acquire some. Oh yes, anyone might be excused for suspecting you.